Okay, good afternoon, everybody. This is Omer with iVision, and I appreciate you taking the time to be on today's webinar. This call will be recorded, so anybody who is unable to attend the call can view it later. So today's call is going to be to review AT&T. That's strange. Today's webinar will be to review AT&T's Code of Conduct policy update. As many of you may have heard or know, AT&T really recently issued some updates to their Code of Conduct, so we'll be reviewing that today. As always, everybody's been muted for this presentation, so if you have any questions or comments, please type them into the Join Me chat. All right. So before we explore AT&T's changes to their Code of Conduct, it's really important first to understand the mobile landscape. So we want to review some of the different messaging technologies that are available in North America, so everybody's on the same page with regards to lingo and technology and things of that nature. So we're looking at A2P versus P2P, and what is that exactly? Well, A2P is what's considered application to person. It's basically a computer messaging a person, whereas P2P is person to person. A2P includes the use of short codes, which are typically 5 to 6 digits. Now, short codes do require carrier approvals. They go through what's called a provisioning process that takes upwards of 2 to 4 weeks. Costs are high for the typical business for a short code. There's setup fees involved. There's a leasing fee involved for the short code, whether you're getting a random or a vanity short code. And then there are monthly maintenance fees that will range depending on the provider that you're working with for those short codes. The benefit of having a short code is that you have high throughput and you're able of transacting high volume messages. So essentially it's a commercial pipe for delivering high volume messaging. And short codes are subject, or messaging on short codes are subject to carrier tariffs. So as of the last few years, as you know, multiple carriers have implemented tariffs or surcharges on messaging, and short code messaging are subject to those tariffs. Also under the realm of application to person messaging is what's called text-enabled toll-free numbers. Now these are 10-digit numbers, relatively new technology that's been around as of the last few years. And it involves essentially enabling a toll-free number for text messaging communication. Nowadays, toll-free numbers are not as common for businesses as they were back in the 90s and maybe the early 2000s. So it's relatively new, and we're not seeing that much activity from text-enabled toll-free numbers just yet, but they are classified as A2P, application-to-person technology, in the sense that typically a toll-free number is for a business. Now, on the opposite side of the spectrum is what we call P2P, or person-to-person. Personal cellular phones are considered P2P. They're person-to-person messaging. Also under P2P is what we call long codes, 10-digit numbers. These are numbers that are not commercially approved on the carrier networks. They are not subject to the carrier tariffs because they operate under the radar, if you will. And because they are P2P, they do not support high-volume messaging, and they offer a very low throughput. Throughput is the amount of messages that are able to be sent in a second, for example, or in a certain period of time. With short codes, we can deliver hundreds of messages per second, and with long codes, we're essentially limited to about 1 message per second. So it's a much different dynamic in terms of the messaging capabilities. And another downside to long codes is that they can be easily blocked or disabled by the carriers. If the carrier sees something that they don't like, whether it's high volume, whether it's something that they have their different processes in place for filtering messages and looking at content, they can easily block or disable a long code. Then you have shared short codes versus dedicated short codes. Now, shared short codes are very common in the industry. And essentially, they reduce the overall cost to the brands and the users, because the typical Joe's Pizza on the corner cannot afford the cost of a dedicated short code. Now, over the years, and we've been in the business since 2006, there's been no formal policy of approval of shared short codes by the carriers, but they've been considered kind of unofficially official. So the carriers have essentially kind of cast a blind eye to shared short codes because it's such a prevalent part of the industry. A lot of activity in the industry exists on shared short codes, but several carriers don't have actually a formal policy of approving shared short codes, but they've let these codes essentially operate. Availability of keywords, as you know, can be an issue on a shared short code, and there could be potential crossover from people that are opting into other campaigns inadvertently on a shared short code. So if somebody's using a very generic keyword, somebody happens to text in a response or reply to another message, they could inadvertently opt in to the wrong campaign, and that happens occasionally on a shared short code. Dedicated short codes, on the other hand, are preferred and formally recognized by the carriers. The messaging content on dedicated short codes belongs to one brand, one single user. So that content provider has unlimited keyword availability. But the downside is that that user, that content provider, is also responsible for paying the cost of the short code setup and the ongoing fees. So when we look at the changes to the At&T Code of Conduct, these changes were put out there in October of 2018. They don't really go into effect until sometime in 2019 or even later. What are the motivations behind it? You have to ask yourself, is it additional revenue in the form of tariffs? Is it reducing spam and call center complaints? And it's also evolving industry trends. So we are in the mobile industry, a relatively new industry, if you will, and it's still evolving. It's still changing. So these are some of the motivations behind this Code of Conduct policy shift. And there are certain key changes to At&T's Code of Conduct. The first is they're going to talk a little bit about consumer consent. Then they're going to highlight prohibited campaign types. Then they've addressed shared short codes, which are prohibited with exceptions. And then they announced the future rollout of what they call 10 DLC A2P messaging. So 10 DLC stands for 10-digit long code. A2P stands for application to person messaging. And what they're looking to essentially do is to legitimize digital long code traffic. So how to treat consumer consent. The main underlying change here or update to their policy is that consumer consent may not be bought, sold, rented, or shared. Okay, that's the underlying theme here. If somebody has ever contacted you and said, hey, I would like to purchase a list of cell phone subscribers, that just doesn't happen in the mobile industry. It might exist with email and direct mail, things like that, but it's not really a part of the mobile industry, and they want to be really strict about consent. So that means that your disclaimer language must clearly articulate what a consumer is opting into. And you really cannot share databases across other business types or messaging programs. So when somebody's opting into a specific program, a specific campaign, the messaging has to be consistent with what they have originally opted into. Second, the policy updates covers prohibited campaign types. Now, this unfortunately is where the large majority of the spam comes from on shared short codes. Affiliate lead and or commission generation. So affiliate lead, affiliate networking, messaging, earn money, things like that are prohibited under this new policy. Loan advertisements, payday loans, green money, green tree lending, those types of lending offers that go out in bulk to subscribers are prohibited. Excepted from that, or an exception from that, would be messages coming from direct lenders for a secured loan, so messaging related to your actual loan. Credit repair, debt relief, work from home, secret shopper, and similar type campaigns. Any type of lead generation campaign that indicates the sharing of information with third parties is also prohibited. And then some of the elements of the shaft content, so sex, hate, obviously is prohibited content. And then alcohol, fire, and tobacco, we have already covered this on a previous webinar where you have to implement the proper age verification for those types of messaging. So us as service providers and our upstream aggregators and some of the intercarrier vendors are really expected to enforce these restrictions on our own networks and to prevent these types of content at the source. So it's up to all of us as service providers, as mobile marketers, to ensure that our clients are adhering to the policy updates. Violation of prohibited messaging content. So if a message sender is observed sending any of the disallowed content, then an account review may be performed by At&T or its agents. And by its agents, they refer to third-party companies that basically scour the internet or scour messaging and look for content that is prohibited. And this review can result in the suspension of sending rights for a provision, phone number, or shortcode, restriction of high throughput access, and suspension of provisioning rights for new shortcodes, and or suspension of all network services. So they kind of, say, listen, you are responsible for adhering to the guidelines, and if you are going to fail to adhere to the guidelines, then that violation can result in the following. And so we want to take this very seriously. We want to ensure that we are not sending anything that we are not allowed to send. Third, the policy updates cover shared shortcodes and the fact that shared shortcodes will now be prohibited. So if what they said is effective immediately, no new shared shortcodes may be provisioned. Okay, it doesn't address existing shortcodes, but new shortcodes may not be provisioned as or designated as shared. Now, they do indicate that there are some enterprise-based use case exceptions. Okay, and they haven't delved into too much detail, but it involves campaigns or shortcodes that have interactive messaging, bots, RCS, and any third-party content control. Essentially, all of our shortcodes kind of use those interactive messaging and third-party content control features, so we are waiting for some clarity on what these exceptions are for shared shortcodes. So they haven't outlawed them entirely, but they have kind of opened the door for some exceptions, and we are waiting for more clarity on what those exceptions are. And they basically stated that all existing shared shortcodes will be terminated at a future date to be determined, consistent with the availability of 10 DLC A2P messaging. So once they roll out commercial long codes that are high throughput, high volume long codes that are going to be approved on their networks, at that point, they will start transitioning shortcode activity to digital. And I apologize, I'm not sure why the recording keeps disconnecting here, but I'll keep reactivating it. So essentially, we don't know when the digital long codes are coming out, but at that point, they will start phasing out shared shortcode support. And lastly, as part of their policy update, they announced the announcement of the future rollout of 10 DLC A2P messaging. So remember, 10 DLC stands for 10-digit long code. A2P means application. Oh, gets a little frustrating. Okay, so commercial availability of long code supporting high volume throughputs. There are no firm dates or timelines provided. They indicated that it's going to be sometime in Q2 or Q3 of 2019 or perhaps later. The carriers are somewhat notorious for just kind of dragging their feet with certain things. But we do know that the carriers have been working for quite some time on legitimizing long code traffic. So this has been in the works for quite some time. Why there hasn't been any coordination amongst the other carriers? And why they haven't coordinated this rollout with other carriers is unknown, but they have taken preemptive steps on their end to roll this out. So unfortunately, there's no further details available at this time, and also these 10-digit long codes will be subject to carrier tariffs. At the end of the day, they're trying to monetize messaging, and so they are going to be implementing similar tariffs for these long codes and long. And I really do apologize. I'm not sure why the recording keeps stopping here. It's very, very random. And who knows what's going to happen with the other carriers in terms of rolling it out, rolling similar technology out. But my guess is that other carriers will potentially follow suit in implementing their own 10 DLC and also with potentially terminating support for shared shortcodes. So what does this all mean? Well, okay, if we have any more problems with the recording, we'll just not record it anymore. So we asked our upstream partners some initial questions to get more input on the situation, and here are some of the questions and answers they provided. So this is actually pretty helpful for getting a good sense. So what happens to our existing shortcodes? Well, for dedicated shortcodes, there will be no change. For shared shortcodes, AT&T wants content providers to operate on a dedicated long code or a dedicated shortcode. So there will be a transition from shared shortcodes to